just welcome our next speaker, who is Abeer Seikaly. She is in Amman, Jordan, and I'm very excited to hear about her work today. She is a thinker and maker whose discipline transverses architecture, design, and cultural production, as well as art.
So thank you, Philip, for having me here. And I just wanted to begin by saying that my work comes to life through craft-led processes that involve field research, sensorial interaction, and hand-making techniques. And in the past 2 years, I've been focusing part of my research on traditional practices of tent crafting in Jordan, as well as the utilization of local resources and heritage in contemporary applications of design. And so interlacing technology with traditional handcrafting and sensorial techniques are a key factor in my process, and an active attempt at creating new forms of cultural production. So I'm going to just start by giving some background information. I feel that this part of the people are not very familiar of this part of the world, and I'd like to start this talk with an image of my great-grandmother, Aida Shwehat, who is posing with her twin daughters, Marta and Elaine. And Aida was a Baduin weaver who wove rugs and Baduin homes. And 10 years ago, I inherited this traditional Bedouin rug hand woven by my great-grandmother. And of course, the Bedouin rugs, there are a combination of Bedouin and rural rugs that exist in different parts of Jordan. And this specific one is referred to as the fidje and is characteristic through its colors and pattern to Madaba, which is a holy city in Jordan that's actually mentioned in the Bible. And, you know, in Jordan, rugs are traditionally passed on through the family. So my mother's side of the family is related by blood to what's called the Azizat Tribe. It's the oldest Christian tribe in Jordan. And the reason why I mention this is because there's usually this misconception that this part of the world is Muslim, but on the contrary, and also the region, you know, in the past, you know, has been through a lot of turmoil. And so relearning about my roots once again makes me feel reconnected to this part of the world, which has been colonized, as I said, and stripped of its cultural identity. This is just a reference that I wanted to share. It's a book called Hands and Hearts. A Jordanian art collector took it upon himself to preserve the Bedouin art of weaving. And from his careful collection of traditional weavings, he decided to create this book to showcase this dying art form with the hope of to revive it. And the book includes really beautiful color photographs of a variety of types of weavings and of the past around, I would say, 150 years. And just a general introduction about traditional Bedouin weaving. So in Jordan, rugs are still woven on traditional ground loom, constructed of stones, sticks, and other available material. And each Bedouin tribe has distinct designs that mark the weavings. Most are based on ancient patterns, often taken from mosaics and ancient scripts, copied by past weavers and adopted as new designs that, you know, become traditional designs with time. And the Bedouin women wove tents from the hair of goats or the wool of sheep. And they erected the tents and packed them up. And this is an image of a Bedouin woman weaving in 1898, so close to the time that my great-grandmother was weaving her rugs. And it's very rare to see this today because many tribes have abandoned their nomadic ways, seeking, a more urban existence. And, this housing and weaving as a way of life is really becoming a phenomenon of the past. And here I wanted to really to illustrate the ground loom and just talk a bit more in detail about this beautifully adapted loom, which is used by a nomadic lifestyle. And it can be rolled up and easily transported. So the Bedouins have always been resourceful and adaptable to the harsh desert environment. And originally, Bedouin weaving was very practical. So the loom, if you look at the image, consists of 4 rods and 4 tent stakes, a front and a back beam made of wood or metal are tensioned horizontally on the ground against the tent stakes, usually reinforcing rods hammered into the ground, a stake at each end of each beam. And a continuous warp is stretched along the ground over 2 rods in a figure 8 formation. And a wooden stick, the heddle bar, rests on gallon tins or bricks to raise it above the warps at the cross of the figure 8. And yarn heddles are looped over the rod and down to catch the upper set of warps from the forward side of the cross. And so this way, alternate warps are kept in order and are easily lifted and pushed down. Before each pass of cross-wire yarn, the weft is inserted into the opening between them. And the 4th stick is the cross rod, a stick which maintains the cross of the figure 8. During weaving and is placed between the warps to the rear of the cross. And you can see in this image also there are some other tools that include a flat wooden sword beater, a hook beater, a traditional gazelle horn and a shuttle. And again, this is very fascinating because, as I mentioned, these nomads were very resourceful and usually just used whatever material that they found. Also, my desire to research about traditional Bedouin weaving and tent making craftsmanship really springs from my love of textiles and, of course, particularly the weaving of nomads. And these are just examples of books that have been great references and contain detailed information about weaving from Jordan and its neighboring countries. And what I'll be presenting is my work and research through my practice, which is rooted in the processes of memory and cultural empowerment. So you'll see more of my personal creative processes and experiences and a meeting point between different themes, observations, and feelings that I've embodied over the period of many years. So my first response to reconcile the rhythms of my past with my present reality was through this wall hanging which I designed, which sought to reawaken the tradition and recall its memories, that tradition of the Bedouins, Bedouin weaving. And I was initially inspired by my great-grandmother's hand-woven rug and designed this piece through an intuitive process that became, I would say, as much an exercise in recreating traditional weaving patterns as it was marked by my own contemporary interpretation. And the tribute that took 3 women and about 6 months to craft really aimed to acknowledge the contribution and the silent self-expression of the nameless Bedouin craftswomen and the accumulative design processes they passed down from generation to generation. And this is just a close-up detail. And one thing that I wanted to actually explore was this interplay between something that is figurative and something that is more pattern-based. So over the years, I've been developing three-dimensional textiles through a multi-layered approach. And my work is inspired by principles originating in nature, in tradition, and in technology. And these elements are linked and are always in a state of this perpetual movement. So cultural heritage has played a central role in my research as I've been looking at weaving and nomadic life, which for me, and actually weaving and nomadic life is a cooperative and it's an interactive process that is crystallized around the arts and crafts. And it also serves functional and social needs, but also notions of biomimicry, like what you see over here with the snake skin, is efficient and it performs many functions from expanding to protecting it from dehydration. And this has been a huge learning for me, looking at different forms from nature. But also my interest and work extend to folding and origami and kirigami, which have opened completely new fields of study. And I've used them as a framework for designing different material and mechanical system. And this was kind of my first attempt at exploring some of these material and mechanical systems. It is through a project called Weaving a Home, which is still ongoing, and it's a development of a performative structural fabric systems that originally explored the social implications of creating homes for displaced communities. And while humanity moved from nomadic to sedentary civilizations, we are at the crux of in its evolution, across all continents. And rapid growth in population, urbanization, political strife, the ongoing agricultural revolution, and climate change are directing our existence back to a more nomadic lifestyle. And so weaving a home synthesizes structure, I would say architecture and landscape, to create spatial and material experiences that amplifies the importance of ecology and the environment, and really transforming our understanding from something that's static and load bearing, so as an enclosure, to more of a communicative and dynamic enclosure that could provide the context through which communities can interact and thrive in their environment. So the premise of weaving a home, this is actually an interior view that was part of the initial concept I envisioned. And the premise of weaving a home is on an examination of multi-layered fabric architecture, as well as building skins that combine performative and aesthetic quality. And while making different forms of textiles and membrane structures over the years, I've been rethinking the role of fabric in architecture in a way where, it can carry several performances. So here, the dome I conceptualized is made out of a collapsible structure fabric that can expand and enclose to adapt to different weather conditions, and whose external structure creates conduits for the provision of services such as electricity and water. And I had initially imagined the honeycombed structure to absorb solar energy, which would be transformed into electrical power, that's stored in specialized batteries and helping to provide electricity. And generally the contemporary, let's say, contemporary needs of daily life. This is, I built a quarter scale prototype in collaboration with engineers and fabric architecture manufacturers in 2015. This is a quarter dome prototype. And what I'd like to say is that the project has gone through multiple phases and served different purposes since its inception, many years ago. And the objective, as I mentioned, was to build a portable and a functional, I would say a spiritual shelter for displaced communities through the development of this double-layered structural fabric, which was turned into a dome. But the concrete elements of the structural fabric, the designs linked to culture and heritage, and my study of the less tangible memories and social conditions of a variety of users over the years, always had to do with the question of improving the well-being of a community beyond simply providing functional solutions. So I started asking a lot of questions, and my creative process is driven by a series of questions. So in this case, it was like, how can the design of a shelter truly create added value? And how can, architecture become a social technology and a cultural practice? How can a shelter be designed and built by the community using local resources? And this prototype was very revelatory because, I wasn't really connecting with the material. And this was always, the big question that I would receive is, what is the material that you're using? And I, never could give a clear response to that. And so these questions, took me back to the indigenous knowledge of the traditional Baduin tent, which for me resides in a silent architecture of everyday life. And it's a knowledge that my great-grandmother embodied. She, wove a home using goat's hair, a process that makes crucial use of her mind, her body and hands, and a relationship that is at the foundation of Bedouin social practice and knowledge. Here you see a woman connecting strips of cloth together to create the roof of the tent. But what I wanted to say is that these days, these embodied approaches to making are increasingly being lost to industrial modes of production. And in many ways, our concept of technology has narrowed alongside that transformation. So in gaining certain technologies, we've lost others, including the social technology of placemaking. This is a still from a video piece that I created entitled Matters of Time, where it was envisioned for an exhibition about climate change and the patriarchy. And this is when I began seriously exploring Bedouin tent making craftsmanship. So the women for centuries, the women of the Jordanian nomadic Badia, Badia is the desert, communities have assembled their tribe's tents known as Beit al-Sha'r. Beit al-Sha'r translates directly to house of hair. So you see it in the above image. So weaving yards of tent material from the hair of goats and the wool of sheep. So the image above you, the black is the goat's hair, and the white strips which are the back wall, which can actually be rolled up depending on the weather, is made out of wool. It's a combination of both. So with limited resources, weaving has been kind of the woman's means of self-expression, in the face of societal submission for centuries. I would call them architects silenced in a world of men. And for them, and actually not only for them, but for most of indigenous communities, responding to the environment has never been an intellectual exercise. It is their way of life, and it's a sacred duty. First of all, what I'd like to say about this image here is that these are some of the construction materials and tools used to build the Baduin tent. So you have the scissors, and I'll get into more detail about these processes. But what struck me when I did this film, and what I was thinking about, is how can I communicate this, let's say, matriarchal architecture. And I always feel in my work that what's important and a very good way to communicate to people is by creating contrasts. And so when I went to the desert to learn about the tent weaving, I came across these stone and concrete structures, which I thought, could one day be deserted and could be left as ruins in those shifting sands. So Beit al-Sha'ar was really a symbol of their voices in which their daily lives unfolded. So the video, which is available online, aims to reveal this kind of matriarchal architecture and its purposeful and centuries-old social weaving process, an adaptive, and I'll go back to this image, an adaptive response to the harsh climate of the Jordanian Badia, but with the enroaching impact of tourism to their territories. The Baduin tribes of Wadi Rum, which is the area that I was filming in and researching, have increasingly abandoned their pastoral existence to engage with the emergent economy and influx of travelers. And this shift has manifested in the most extraordinary ways, as men are called out to build concrete structures and, erect supposed eco-lodge bubbles. And it's funny because, when I look at these bubbles in a very weird way, I remember my tent. And when I saw that, I just felt the need to go back and reassess and reframe the project in a different way, rather than thinking about it as a product, but thinking about it more as a social technology. So. And a cultural practice. So these women held the knowledge of this adaptive environmental tent craftsmanship was hidden behind, let's say, another block in this patriarchal wall. And in this image, you see some of the materials that I found on site: concrete, cinder blocks, just other silicon and other steel and other materials that for me are, not sustainable, I would say. I'm now made it a mission to develop the structural fabric and my material system using natural raw materials. So tent making craftsmanship and the composition of the Bedouin home is an important reference point for developing the structural fabric. And here you see a multi-layered structural and material system in two ways. So one, it's a flat assembly, and on the left, it's a dome assembly. So if we look at the Bedouin tent, going back to that, because it has been my, constant point of reference, the Bedouin tent is a responsive archetype and a performative architecture, which should be asserted as a composite material structural design and attributed to the lineage of women who have communally and intuitively engineered it. In this diagram, for example, I illustrated a plan of a 3-pole tent where long yards of cloth are woven on the ground loom and connected to one another to create the roof of the tent. On the right are traditional measurements used by the women to determine cloth sizes. And this is one thing that really fascinated me, is that their body served as a measuring device to manifest their homes. So in fact, the Bedouin tent is a manifestation of the Bedouin woman's body. Finally, on this slide is a detailed view of the surfaced appearance of the warp-faced weave, which creates, as you can see, this diagonal pattern. So here I really now delved into goat hair yarn processing, and during my field research, I found that the craft of making yarn, has not been practiced with most women for over 20 years. And this really bothered me. And, you know, there was a lot of resistance to get back into making that yarn again. But, you know, after a few visits and some interaction and introduction with the women and showing them the work that I do, they kind of, you know, accepted to go back and create the yarn. And so I began working with a community of women from different parts of the country, which entails many steps. And over here, you see there's the clipping of the goat's hair. And then what they do after they clip it is they put it on the ground and they hammer it in order to remove all of the dirt, but also let the hair become entangled. So it will make it easier for them to roll it, as you see down and on the bottom left corner. And then after they roll it, it is kind of, I would say, spiraled around their arms and spun using a spindle. And then after that, let's say it's turned into balls, yarn balls. And so I began producing a lot of yarns with these women. Now, going back to my material system and the assembly, my objective was to create a double curved surface, which is called a hyperbolic paraboloid, which is what you see here. And as I experimented, I realized that the traditional weaving technique did not respond to the shape that I wanted to create. And I learned, as I learned how to weave myself, I realized that this technique required more yarn. You know, it was heavy, and the weaving technique does not allow for flexibility and material stretchability. So I went back to my studio and a drawing board, and I proceeded with making models and learning how to weave. Helped me identify what material properties and behaviors are required in order to achieve the desired form and function. And model making is how I work. More than I draw, I make models. And here you can see the system created, and of course in the middle images collapsed. So it's a moving, let's say, material system. So the processed yarn, here I started experimenting with the processed yarn. So instead of weaving it, I started experimenting with knitting it into a three-dimensional and double-sided material. So here you see like several experiments, prototypes using different materials that, you know, in order to understand some of the parameters and arrive at an outcome where the material was flexible, was porous, and it was strong. And making prototypes, you know, helps me understand in general how material behaves in relation to other members and how, you know, modules can be connected and so on. And so a stretchable three-dimensional material is hand knitted with a community of women using a specific stitching pattern. And these images this image shows one of the women actually working on the knitting. And these images show the stretchable stitch pattern knitted, which uses two materials. It's using goat hair and jute, as they have different tensile properties. And I noticed that, you know, when they are combined, linking the two different fibers makes the cloth stronger and more taut. And so the knitted pieces respond to the shape of the hypar, allowing for the doubly curved surface that I wanted to create. So we created 86 knitted material modules. So each square that you see over here was knitted separately. And they were connected through a variety of different types of seam patterns. Because the cloth transforms into a three-dimensional structural form, the modules are first connected flat based on a predetermined pattern, which is composed of two layers. So here what you see is the top and the front and the back And there are two layers here that are connected to one another. And so the cells, are repeated 3 times on both X and Z axis. And, I considered the membranes in terms of their limitations as well as their potential when putting these pieces together. So the task of designing and materializing this handmade material system was a very personal and communal expression of the Baduin tent. The dynamic process of making the structure is reflected in its functionality. And here you see a network of elements that support each other and manifest as considered approaches to material, structure, space, and adaptive responses to the environment. So there's a combination of wooden rods that were threaded through the seam patterns, and then metal connectors that connected the joints through a kind of a pre-stressed condition. And guiding this development process of the self-structuring lattice was an intention to renew and adapt tradition and culture to meet the challenges of our rapidly changing and globalized world. And so if you look at each column over here, in actuality, the scale of it is resembling the scale of the Bedouin tent roof. So while each cloth of the Bedouin tent is around 60 centimeters, the width of each cloth is actually around 55 centimeters. And in this drawing, you see, let's say, a top view, which shows the alternating hyperbolic structure, as well as its possibility to be compacted as a membrane structure. And this is the final structure, which was shown at Amman Design Week last year. And guiding this design and development of the self-supporting structure was, or I would say, let's say, my intimate contact with the work's production and materials, as well as the women and natural landscape from which it draws its inspiration, has led me to construct this artwork that aspires to become a model for how architecture and design processes can act as instruments for social change. This is here is a more a close-up view of the hexagonal unit cells, and this matrix creates the stable material system. And here you can see a view from inside one of the columns. And actually what I'd like to do is show you a time lapse of the creation of this
كنا نمد الحال نمشي هيك مسافة بعيدة بعد هذا التلة ناخذ الخيط هذا نمشي عشان نعمل شقاق، نروح واحدة تقعد على راسها وواحدة تقعد فوقها، وكنا هذا الخيط نمشي فيه ونروح ونجي، وبعدين يظل ينطرف على الشقة بالمحتى لما يجهزنها. كيف كانوا يشتغلوا وكيف كانت يعني قد ما احنا الحين الحمد لله نعمة، الغسالات نعمة الحمد لله. هو التطور حلو، مو حلو، بس رغم التطور لا تنسى أن احنا ابعدنا، لان ما في حد يعني بيني وبينك، حتى لما تحكي عن بيت الشعر تلاقي حتى الاولاد ما يساعدوكي، حتى الاولاد ما يساعدوا. بيت الشعر من لينا منا مثلا تعالوا يا وليدي خلينا الحين في المناسبات يروحوا يتصلوا مع تبع الخيم عشان ما يبنوا بيت الشعر، رغم انه يحسسك بيت الشعر لما يتقرب وهيبه. انا قبل ما اخلفه يعني كنت اغزل وشي، الحين صرنا نشتري جاهز. هسه غنم ما عندنا، الغنم ما عندنا الحين، بطلت الغنم بطلت، بس عندي بيت شعر محتفظه فيه رغم هذا كله كل شيء.
So here this is a Bedouin, one of the Bedouin ladies, talking about the meeting points between tradition, tent making, and technology. What I wanted to say is that with architecture, design, art, and cultural production are informing my practice, my work is constantly navigating between various meeting points, and it's led by the pursuit of questions and encounters between different cultures, times, and spaces. And my approach to design is intuitive, experimental, and collaborative, valuing community participation and creating room for architectural possibilities that can propel new modes of living, building, and dwelling in the 21st century. This is a quarter scale prototype which I recently created for an exhibition at Fundación Telefónica in Madrid. And what I wanted to say is that my next prototype hopes to utilize goat's hair and build the tent using those natural resources, with also a new thinking approach that is more about a cradle to cradle type of living, something that springs from the environment but also has the potential to go back into the environment without harming it. And that's it. Thank you. If anyone would like to see more information about the works, so they can visit my website as well. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much for such a beautiful and eloquent presentation or explanation of this very complex structures. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.